Chile. An attempt at historic compromise. The real story of the Allende years. By Jorge Palacios. Part 5. Contradictions within the forces of the opposition and of the government. Chapter 11. 3. Errors of the petty bourgeois opposition. The petty bourgeois opposition to the dominant trend within the UP and the Allende government suffered, as we have said, from a number of errors and weaknesses which prevented it from offering a revolutionary alternative despite very favorable conditions. We will now point out some of these erroneous conceptions. 1. One of the main faults of the radical tendency in the UP and of MIR was that they were incapable of understanding, and many still do not understand today, the plan of the CP leaders and their conscious supporters for phony socialism and the underlying reasons for the revisionist indirect strategy of alliance with the CDP, a strategy deriving from the nature of their plan given the conditions of U.S. imperialist hegemony in Chile. They believed that the CP leaders' plan was a genuine plan of advance towards socialism, but a plan implemented under the leadership of those who mistakenly used reformist and opportunist methods. MIR, for example, whose differences with the dominant group in the UP were the most pronounced, stated in its documents that, quote, "They are taking a road different from ours and have never regarded our development sympathetically. But despite everything, nothing makes them our enemies," end quote. Thus forgetting that according to the teachings of Lenin, the revisionist leaders are, quote, "better defenders of the bourgeoisie than the bourgeoisie itself," end quote, and that, quote, "if they did not lead the workers, the bourgeoisie could not remain in power," end quote. Because they did not understand the profoundly reactionary nature of the revisionist leadership, falsifiers of Marxism, they thought revisionism was merely a reformist trend, and still today call it worker reformist. They believed it was possible to correct or to bypass the line of the revisionists without exposing them or depriving them of mass support, without fighting or breaking with the hegemony they exercised over the UP and the government. Although they promote some reforms in order to use the mass movement to their advantage and to demagogically deceive the people, the revisionists are not mere bourgeois reformists, much less worker reformists. The various strata of the petty and middle bourgeoisie, to the extent that they are reformist, aspire to develop, towed along by the proletariat, at the expense of the big bourgeoisie and imperialism to take power for themselves. On this level, the proletariat can and must use these objective contradictions to liquidate domestic and imperialist big capital, on condition it maintains supremacy and leadership in the process. This strength and leading role must ensure that the petty and middle bourgeoisie do not lead the process, for this would result in compromise and defeat, and that they do not take advantage of it to convert themselves into a big bourgeoisie when victory is won. In reality, in our country, given the weakness of the petty and middle bourgeoisie and their close links with the imperialist and internal monopoly capital, the first outcome is the most likely if they lead the process. That is, capitulation and compromise with imperialist and domestic big capital. Bourgeois reformist leaders of the revisionist or phony Marxist type, on the other hand, attempt to distort the historic role of the proletariat, to distort its ideology, and to deceive it for the benefit of their plan for state capitalism. On the one hand, they strive to wipe out the revolutionary mission of the proletariat through false ideological and political concepts, to suppress its leading role, to prevent it from leading the people in the destruction of the bourgeois state and the real conquest of power. On the other hand, they work to promote certain reforms, to use their influence on the proletariat and even the alliance of the proletariat with the small and middle bourgeoisie, to occupy with their upper bureaucracy the position of exploiters that was held by the big bourgeoisie and the imperialist monopolies. They propose to take over the economy and political power either by replacing some of these old exploiters or by temporarily associating themselves with them. It is this process of replacing domestic and imperialist big capital with a new bureaucratic bourgeoisie coming from their ranks that they call building socialism. Because of their reactionary nature, they must carry out this plan without destroying the basic institutions and laws of the bourgeois state. Consequently, the proletariat cannot agree to an alliance with the revisionist leaders, with these phony Marxists, and it cannot consider them as bourgeois reformists, for they want nothing less than to supplant the proletarian leadership and to falsely claim to be the ideological and political representatives of the proletariat so as to betray its interests and take the place of the big exploiters. Moreover, at the present time, when false Marxists of this type are in power in a number of countries and have created one of the two superpowers, a social imperialist bureaucratic bourgeoisie, their role as political swindlers has become more dangerous and effective throughout the world. They no longer represent only their local interests and ambitions to become a big bureaucratic state bourgeoisie, but also voracious interests of international domination and exploitation of the peoples of the world, the interests of the Soviet social imperialist bureaucratic bourgeoisie. This makes them doubly dangerous and distinguishes them still more clearly from the traditional bourgeois reformist circles. Obviously, in characterizing the phony communists, we are referring to the leading circles of the CP. In its rank and file, there are many militants, and in Chile, they include many workers, who are duped by these leaders and who must be won over by and to a genuine proletarian leadership. In this sense, the fact that there are many misled workers in the ranks of the phony communist parties, a fact that has led some to label them worker reformist parties so as to justify an alliance with them, far from justifying this label and this alliance, only shows the urgency of exposing and fighting such leaders. The fact that they succeed in leading on and duping working-class militants testifies precisely to their role of political swindlers and to the difference between them and the genuine, traditional bourgeois reformist trends. This failure to understand the reactionary essence of revisionism led the radicalized section of the UP and MIR to fight the government and the leading group in the UP, both under the hegemony of the CP leadership, by criticizing secondary defects of their policy, such as their sectarianism, their tendency to compromise, their role as a brake on the struggle of the masses, and so on, or by trying, without breaking with their leadership, to present them with fait accompli so as to divert them from their scandalously opportunist course. These radicalized elements did not see that there was total incompatibility between the CP leadership's phony plan of advance towards socialism, or rather, its plan for state capitalism, and the revolutionary mobilization of the people to win political power under the leadership of the proletariat. They did not understand that its phony strategy of peaceful road to power, its penetration of the legality and institutions of the bourgeois state, its praise for and subordination to the reactionary armed forces, and its obsession with concluding an agreement with the CDP, that all this was inherent in, and inseparable from, its plan to replace one system of exploitation by another, by a system over which it dreamed to rule. 2. Another aspect of the errors that governed the behavior of the radicalized group in the UP and of MIR was their false concept of unity. Failing to understand the essentially reactionary nature of the phony communist leaders, they did not understand the necessity of breaking with them and of creating a new pole of regroupment under revolutionary leadership. They forgot Lenin's teaching, quote, "The only Marxist line in the world labor movement is to explain to the masses the inevitability and necessity of breaking with opportunism, to educate them for revolution by waging a relentless struggle against opportunism," end quote. They let themselves be taken in by a false unity, a unity which, in the last analysis, meant maintaining the revisionist domination over all these political forces by means of the blackmail of calling any attempt at independence splittist. They did not see that if the unity is with an anti-proletarian and anti-popular line, then the more the masses are dragged into this unity, the more there is a split with the real interests of the proletariat and the people. If the people as a whole follow it, then it is the people as a whole who have been cut off from their interests, and linked to the interests of the bourgeoisie, whether the old bourgeoisie or the one that wants to replace it. They did not understand that the only correct unity with respect to the CP was unity with its misled rank and file in order to win them over to a correct line through an uncompromising struggle in principle and in practice against these opportunist leaders. This was precisely the tactic followed by Lenin and the Bolsheviks when they temporarily united in the Soviets with the Mensheviks who controlled the leading bodies. They did so in order to resolutely fight the Menshevik leadership and win over the masses to break with this leadership, bringing revolutionary, insurrectional politics to the Soviets. The false concept of unity around the reactionary line of the CP leadership, which always won out in the end, gave rise to the false buildup of numbers that characterized the UP. These great numbers of people were united on the basis of the systematic paralysis of their struggles, on the basis of gigantic parades, which in the face of the reactionary opposition were an innocuous display of numbers, on the basis of relegating the workers to the sole task of increasing production, for the purpose of further electoral contests, and finally, on the basis of a verbal repudiation of civil war, a blind confidence in the armed forces, and a rejection of any preparation against the coup d'etat. What purpose did this unity serve? What did this buildup of numbers serve, except to open up the road in the longer term to the plans of the phony communists? A pathetic example of its uselessness, from the standpoint of the interests of the people, was the fact that on September 4, 1973, a week before the coup d'etat, the UP organized the biggest demonstration in Chilean history, mobilizing about 1 million people. Just as it serves no purpose to give a sick person millions of units of an antibiotic that is unsuitable for him, it does not serve the interests of the people to build up numbers, to unite, on the basis of a line and policy contrary to its interests. Despite the blows they received, the radicalized trend in the UP and MIR did not understand that, while it was blackmailing them in the name of unity, the CP leadership actually implemented a brutal policy of splitting and liquidating any trend that deviated from its reactionary designs. It did not hesitate to go over the heads of its allies whenever this was convenient, to provoke splits within these parties by means of infiltrators, to falsify the results of the CUT elections, to implacably oppose and even violently repress timid attempts to unite the masses around a line more militant and less opportunist than its own. Dealing in this manner with the radicalized wing of the UP, the CP leaders dragged it into a shameful unity with the reactionary opposition through the approval of the Arms Control Act and the negotiations on the government program with the CDP. This false concept of unity also led to blind hostility toward the forces, such as the RCP, which were developing a fundamentally correct position and were vigorously calling for the creation of a pole of mass regroupment based on a really revolutionary alternative. A regroupment of this sort, which of course involved breaking with the opportunist CP leadership, would have made it possible to offer a clear perspective of action to the rising mass struggle in order to effectively oppose the putschists and really advance the struggle for political power. Objectively, while the radicalized trend was the receptacle for a large number of elements opposed to the opportunist leadership, it stopped these elements halfway and prevented them from making an in-depth critique so as to reach a consistent revolutionary position. By giving critical support to the UP leadership and the government, it kept these elements attached to the revisionist plan for state capitalism. At most, it offered as an alternative certain diversionary actions that did not represent a correct road. Thus, this trend played the role of a buffer between revisionism and Marxism-Leninism, for the benefit, consciously or not, of the former. 3. Another basic aspect of the erroneous ideas of this petty bourgeois trend was rooted in its mistaken and ambiguous conception regarding the nature of the government and, in general, regarding socialism. The partisans of this trend confused nationalization and socialism, often describing as socialist a government such as Allende's, which, although it nationalized companies, was in no way the expression of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and which had not taken power away from the traditional exploiters. They frequently confused the masses by presenting the activity of the government, which, despite the good intentions of some, essentially implemented the plan of the CP leadership for state capitalism, as the building of socialism. For example, Mir put forward slogans such as "more factories for the people" or "not just one factory or one estate, all the factories, all the states for the people, that is socialism," which implied that the country was advancing towards socialism through mere economic reforms, without prior destruction of the reactionary state power, without the real seizure of political power. Formulated in this manner, these slogans were false even as agitational slogans, for they led the masses to believe that the government expropriations put the factories and other means of production into the hands of the people and actually integrated them into a socialist sector. Aside from the fact that these formulations ignored the true nature of the revisionist plan, which was opposed to socialism, they expressed an economist and reformist conception of the advance towards socialism, separating it from the decisive political question, the seizure of power. In this manner, believing that one could advance towards socialism by simply nationalizing, the partisans of this petty bourgeois trend only succeeded, under the conditions of an acute crisis and a ferocious reactionary offensive, in tying an increasingly heavy rock around the government's neck, speeding up its collapse. This is not counting the fact that, under Trotskyist influence, pretenses were made of correcting the inconsistencies of the government in its socialization of enterprises by attacking all sections of the bourgeoisie and demanding their nationalization. Such demands only recruited more allies for the opposition's coup d'etat command. Paradoxically, this same economist and reformist conception of advance towards socialism led to underestimating and not taking advantage of the fighting spirit and movement of the workers against the shifting of the burden of the crisis onto their backs. Instead of politicizing this movement and transforming it into a struggle for power, those who upheld the conception of advance towards socialism even went so far as to condemn it as economist and anti-socialist, in accordance with the judgment of the CP leadership. Thus, the putschist opposition was allowed on several occasions to demagogically use this fighting spirit to involve some sections of the masses in its subversive plans. 4. Another error common to the radicalized current in the UP and to Mir was to pose the problem of conquering political power in an erroneous manner. Overshadowed or inhibited by the praise of the CP leaders for the armed forces, they did not understand that the conquest of political power necessarily involved organizing and arming the masses to destroy these armed forces. Closing their eyes to this fact, essential for a Marxist, they propagated the illusion that political power could be had by developing, in quantity and quality, a supposed parallel power, built in the shadow of the government, which they called the people's power. What was this so-called people's power? It consisted of organizations uniting a part of the masses of workers, peasants, squatters, and students, organizations relatively independent of the CUT and the trade union federations dominated by the CP bureaucracy. The concrete organizational forms were the industrial cordons, assemblies of delegates from the trade unions in a district of high industrial concentration, the communal commandos, the cordons plus delegates from the shanty towns and the student centers in the district, and a few peasant councils, which were formed democratically by the rank and file. The JAPs in each district were also considered an expression of the people's power. The main features of these organizations were their links with the rank and file. Their functional character, since they brought together the various struggles and demands of a sector of the population, their greater preoccupation with the problems of the masses, wages, supplies, price control, etc., and the ideological and political influence held in them by trends that did not consider themselves interpreters of the official UP and government policy. Using Trotskyist-type speculation to create the illusion that these were organizations of political power, the petty bourgeois opponents of the dominant line in the UP tried to brandish the experience of pre-revolutionary Russia, where the Soviets constituted a power parallel to that of Kerensky's bourgeois government, or rather, in Lenin's definition, an embryo of power. The only problem was that these theoreticians forgot that the Soviets were the product of hard insurrectional struggles by the masses, of the smashing of Tsarist police forces in certain cities, of the rallying of important contingents of the army to the side of the people, and of the absence of the bulk of the reactionary armed forces, which were engaged on distant fronts of the 1914 imperialist war. All this culminated in the overthrow of Tsarism and the temporary appearance of two parallel powers, the bourgeois government and the Soviets. Even then, to transform these embryos of power that were the Soviets into real power, the Bolsheviks had to defeat the opportunist leadership within them and carry out armed insurrection to actually seize power from the hands of the bourgeoisie. Only the Mensheviks and the Trotskyists, there too, were content to unilaterally proclaim the Soviets a parallel power and to demand that the bourgeois government give them greater prerogatives. Thus, they downplayed and went so far as to fight against the preparation and initiation of the insurrection, which for Lenin and the Bolsheviks were an urgent task. In Chile, the prerogatives which these mass organizations exercised, partly with government tolerance, during the October 1972 employers' strike, such as the direct distribution of commodities to the trade unions in shantytowns, the surveillance of merchants and hoarders through the JAPs, the delivery of raw materials to the factories, and other prerogatives resulting directly from mass initiative, such as the confiscation of means of transportation immobilized by the strike, the reopening and management of striking commercial establishments, the distribution of food and raw materials, the formation of vigilante teams in the factories, etc. All this further helped to generate the illusion that these organizations were a form of people's power. However, most of these prerogatives were drastically suppressed by the government itself at the demand of the military cabinet formed following the agreement between the government and the opposition that was credited with ending the employers' strike. Following this agreement, most of the UP members who had participated in the cordons and commandos during the strike deserted them on the orders of their leaders and concentrated on preparing for the March 1973 parliamentary elections. The truth is that most of the activities of the cordons, commandos, and peasant councils was basically defensive. These organizations did not play the really important role that they might have taken on, that of transmitting a revolutionary line to the masses in order to mobilize them, unite them, and prepare them to stand up, with all the means available, to the military coup d'etat that everyone saw coming. Still less did they play the role of centers to guide and unite the people in order to conquer political power. The fact that they did not play any such role was, in large part, due precisely to the erroneous orientation we have discussed, contained in slogans such as create the people's power, which implied that political power, which even the UP government did not control, would be won by a mere buildup of numerical strength in these organizations, which would allow them to exercise certain prerogatives, such as those we have listed, and by virtue of these prerogatives, to proclaim themselves as the people's power. It was precisely the illusion that this is power that greatly helped to hide and obscure a fact it was vital and urgent the people understand, that they did not have power, and that those who did have it were hurriedly preparing to punish them ferociously and to take away everything they had won. Thinking about this today, after all that has happened since the coup d'etat, there's no doubt that mere development of what was called the people's power, conceived as a substitute for the real necessity of preparing to confront putschism and actually conquer political power, would, rather than preventing the coup d'etat, as some still believe today, only have resulted in the death of 100 to 200,000 people or more, instead of 30 or 40,000. Another factor that increased the confusion these so-called people's power organizations created concerning the necessity to seriously prepare for the struggle for power was the unending ambiguity of their relations with the government. This ambiguity resulted from the confused and erroneous ideas of many who participated in these organizations as to the nature of the UP government. Thus, the members of the UP and MIR who participated in them always had an ambiguous and confused position as to whether they represented a people's power independent of and parallel to the government, or whether, in accordance with the idea promoted by the official UP groups that tolerated them, they were only instruments of a people's power supposedly represented by the government. The UP and MIR members never allowed the question to be fully clarified. Were they trying, even through the minor prerogatives won by these organizations, to build a power independent of the government and its opportunist leadership, or organizations designed to support the governmental power? The struggle between these two conceptions not only paralyzed the development and effectiveness of these organizations to a great extent, but also prevented their adopting a correct interpretation of the role that they could play in the struggle against putschism and for the conquest of power. As we stated at the beginning of this chapter, the erroneous ideas on the nature of the government and the armed forces, originating in the baleful influence of revisionist ideology, managed to hide almost completely the necessity of mobilizing the masses for the struggle for power. Although the groups in question considered that power had not been completely won following the 1970 electoral victory, and although they made even more frequent allusions to the inevitability of a confrontation, preparing for this confrontation was never, as it would have been if they had been following a Marxist line, the center of their politics. In practice, they conceived the conquest of power as a system of connecting vessels through which power would be transferred from the hands of the exploiters to the hands of the people through the intensification of the expropriations. During the first stage, when the opportunist orientation imposed on the UP by the CP leadership was not yet very clear, the mass struggle was conceived as a way to put additional means of production into the hands of the government and to consolidate its mass base. This was why the People's Power organizations were not at that time, 1971, thought of as parallel to and independent of the government. Later, as the clashes became more intense between radicalized UP and MIR and those who exercised opportunist domination over the UP, the struggle of those who wished to develop these organizations independently of the government intensified, although an open break with the opportunist leaders was never considered. The transfer of power was then thought of as a double system of connecting vessels. The government would increase its control of power by nationalizing, and the organizations of people's power would progressively transfer it into their own hands by extending their prerogatives and stepping up rank-and-file participation in the state enterprises and workers' control in private enterprises. To illustrate the first stage, we will quote statements made by MIR to the French journalist Catherine Lamour concerning the assassination of one of its peasant leaders. Quote, "It, the government, does not understand, or pretends not to understand, that our policy is not limited to demanding more land. What must be done is to arouse the revolutionary initiative of the peasants. They should not receive the land passively as a right, but should have the feeling of having won it. They should become conscious of the struggle for power that is being waged in this country." End quote. Then, showing what it meant by conquest of power in this period, MIR added, quote, "This is the only way for the popular unity to obtain real mass support in the countryside as elsewhere." End quote. In October 1971, as part of this same homage to Moises Huentelaf, Miguel Enriquez, the supreme leader of MIR, who was to be assassinated by the military junta, stated at a meeting that, quote, "The policy of making concessions and sacrificing the people on the altar of legality in no way strengthens the popular unity." End quote. In the same speech, although criticizing the reformist tendencies of the government, he did not show their inseparable link with a plan leading not toward socialism, but toward state capitalism. Instead, he described these tendencies as incomprehensible on the part of a government, quote, that incorporates large sections of masses in the struggle for socialism, end quote. Quote, but everything is not clear for the workers, end quote, he said. Quote, there have been some actions and measures taken by the government that confuse them, that trouble them, that they don't understand, that nobody explains, and that only a few try to justify, end quote. After listing various anti-popular measures taken by the government, he was satisfied to threaten, quote, despite this government's positive measures, despite the advances achieved by the popular unity, the weakness, concessions, and temptations of some elements in it to set themselves up as arbitrators of the class struggle, leave the workers no other choice but to take back part of the trust that they have given and, by supporting the government's positive measures and fighting its concessions, to begin to define for themselves a road of their own, end quote. Of course, starting from a critique of this kind, it was impossible to begin to define for themselves a road of their own, and right up to the coup d'etat, Mir continued to try to bring about a rectification of the dominant policy in the UP and the government. Mir took a step forward in its critique of the government in November 1972, following the appointment of the military cabinet to solve the October strike. It stated, quote, as a result, a new relationship between the government and the mass movement has been created. Beginning with this cabinet change, the workers will have difficulty aspiring and struggling to make the government an instrument to serve their struggles and a lever to build new forms of people's power. Today, when the reformists are attempting to block the road to the creation of the people's power by forming this UP General's government, the working class and people must, more than ever, struggle to strengthen and develop the coordinating committees, to convert them into embryos of power, into workers' communal councils, which will culminate in a people's assembly and a revolutionary workers' and peasants' government. Struggle to defeat the policy of the new UP General's government, which will lead to the regulation and paralysis of the people's struggle and to concessions to the bosses, end quote. Finally, in May 1973, Miguel Enriquez stated, quote, we maintain that the fundamental task is to build up enough strength, starting from the masses, to prevent civil war or to win it if it is unleashed by the reaction. We will only achieve this buildup of strength by upholding a people's revolutionary program, which will come out of discussion among the working class and people, and by developing and strengthening mass organs which, because they incorporate all sections of the people, will allow the working class to exercise its role of vanguard in relation to the other sections, within the perspective of developing a people's power replacing the bourgeois order and independent of the government, that is, the workers' communal commandos, end quote. Only on August 4, 1973, following the dialogue between President Allende and Aylwin, did the Secretary General of MIR state, quote, the dialogue that has been initiated with Aylwin and Frey has as its objective the unconditional surrender of the government, end quote. He concluded, quote, as of today, the capitulation has not yet been consummated, but no one can have any illusions. The product of this capitulation will not be a left-wing government, a people's government, or a petty bourgeois left-wing government. The capitulation is not only a setback, it actually means a new government. It means that the government is converting itself into a bourgeois government, end quote. Unfortunately, this thesis that the government was converting itself into a bourgeois government was not formulated by MIR until a month before the coup d'etat, despite the fact that MIR was the organization with the most independent positions among those we are discussing. 5. Another basic error of the radicalized trend was not fully understanding the role of the imperialist superpowers in the Chilean problem. The struggle against U.S. imperialism, the main backer of the coup d'etat, was relegated to a secondary position. The partisans of this trend accepted in its general lines the partial and limited anti-imperialist program formulated by the UP, and, what is most serious, they made no contribution to correcting the government's error of confronting the U.S. government's offensive in a conciliatory manner without vigorously mobilizing the masses. We have already seen the consequences of this capitulationist policy and the perspectives which would have been opened up by a firm anti-imperialist struggle. Furthermore, failure to understand the goals pursued by Soviet social imperialism in Chile, as well as the direct or indirect ideological influence of social imperialism on the radicalized section of the UP and on Mir, were decisive factors in the failure of these groups to understand the reactionary nature of the plan social imperialism was carrying out in Chile through the CP leadership. This influence expressed itself in their refusal to break with the opportunist leadership and in their submission to the various forms of falsification of Marxism proper to these revisionists. This neutralist attitude, which the Soviets actually encouraged elements they had not succeeded in bringing around to their positions to adopt, had already manifested itself in the reticence of these groups to take, and their opposition to taking, a stand in the great international debate between the Marxist-Leninists and modern revisionists, which was initiated by the Party of Labor of Albania and the Communist Party of China in the 60s. It was particularly through the Cuban leaders that the Soviet bureaucracy exercised ideological and sometimes other kinds of influence on the rebel sections of the UP and on Mir. These leaders, especially Fidel Castro, gave their approval to the three basic aspects of the Chilean CP leaders' plan for state capitalism: their subordination to the social imperialist bureaucratic bourgeoisie, their deception as to the possibility of conquering political power and advancing towards socialism by the peaceful road, and their farce of passing off a form of state capitalism, as in the USSR, as socialism. On the first point, not only do the facts show that the Cuban government went so far as to support the invasions of Czechoslovakia, but there are statements, such as this one by Fidel Castro on May 1, 1972. Quote, "We have full and absolute confidence in the foreign policy of the USSR," end quote, or his earlier statements that he agreed with this policy, quote, "right down to the details," end quote. With respect to the second point, the peaceful road, Fidel Castro declared in an interview that he granted the CP-run newspaper, Puro Chile, on August 4, 1970, quote, "Categorically, yes. At this particular moment in Chile, I believe it is possible to move towards socialism by the ballot, that is, by means of an election victory. Chile is one of those rare countries in Latin America where constitutional political struggle is carried out within the established order, and the only advantage of the right is that it has greater economic means. The struggle is within the constitutional framework, and that is why, I repeat, in this particular case, in Chile in 1970, socialism can win through an electoral victory," end quote. Finally, with respect to the third point, that of considering what happened in Chile as revolutionary, Castro stated that in the course of his visit to Chile during the UP administration that, quote, "We have sometimes been asked in an academic tone whether we believe that what we are seeing here is a revolutionary process, and we have said unequivocally yes," end quote. The number 2 man in the Cuban CP hierarchy, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, pulled the rug out from under any sympathizers of the Cuban process who upheld the necessity of another road to seize political power, telling them, quote, "For us, there is no revolutionary alternative outside the popular unity and its government," end quote. Furthermore, it is known that Cuban influence on the radicalized section of the UP and on Mir was not only ideological. It also took the form of very tangible pressure to get in line with the revisionist leadership any time they showed inclinations toward independence. Thus, the Cuban leaders filled to perfection the role assigned to them as servants of the reactionary line of the Soviet social imperialist bureaucracy, to neutralize dissidents and ultimately to bring them around to the line of the Soviet leaders. One of the serious consequences of the reticence of the radicalized groups to take clear stands and to denounce the phony Marxism of the Soviet leaders and their disciples, and the phony socialism that hides a ferocious state capitalism in the Soviet-dominated countries, a consequence that still weighs in the difficulties of forming a broad anti-fascist front, was that this reticence made it easier for Frey and company to deceive large sections of the population and drag them into their pro-US policy. The influence of Frey and his team on large sections of the workers, peasants, employees and middle strata, is based on anti-communism. They make people believe that the fascist dictatorships and the harsh systems of state exploitation in the USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries are examples of what they can expect if socialism is established. Naturally, large sections of the masses refuse to fight and risk their lives to go from one system of exploitation to another that everyone sees as worse. To the extent the repression and fierce exploitation in these countries is known, the baleful model of socialism that the pro-Soviet communist parties offer their peoples has created a strong anti-socialist consciousness, to a point where many communist parties, faithful to Moscow, have had to adopt the tactic of simulating differences with their ideological mentors, and go so far as to criticize the repression in these countries when they cannot succeed in hiding it. In Chile, however, the problem is more serious, for the Chilean CP continues to defend what goes on in these countries and to present them as models of socialism. Consequently, the lack of a clear ideological and political position toward the two superpowers has not only obscured the indispensable denunciation of what the CP leaders intend to do in Chile, but has prevented large sections of the masses, including the misled rank and file of the CP, from being won over and mobilized under genuine proletarian leadership. 6. Another of the fundamental errors of the radicalized current in the UP and of MIR was that they did not understand the stage of revolution that Chile was going through and the nature of the united front that had to be built to fight imperialism, the big landlords, and the big monopoly and financial bourgeoisie. Although the UP program only proposed the expropriation of these interests, and that only to open up the road to state capitalism, the UP's achievements in this direction were forever being presented as building socialism. Trotskyist infiltrators in the UP parties and MIR had a big influence on this strategic definition. It was felt one could verbally compensate for the weaknesses shown in the work of annihilating the big exploiters as a class and seizing power from them merely by defining what was happening as a socialist revolution. In reality, even if the proposed changes had been the result of a real conquest of political power, even if the expropriated power and wealth had really been in the hands of the people, this would only have been a step towards a people's democratic revolution, anti-imperialist, anti-monopolist, and anti-latifundist in character, and not the immediate establishment of socialism. And this goal is completely correct, for the people's democratic revolution is a necessary first stage in a country that is at a low level of capitalist development and that is dependent on imperialism, such as Chile. A leftist definition of the strategic goals, combined with a reformist practical strategy and tactics, such as the UP implemented, is the best formula for total ruin, which is exactly what occurred. While verbally burning stages in the purest Trotskyist style, the UP in practice did not even secure the minimum conditions for the accomplishment of the people's democratic revolution. On the one hand, attempts were made to expropriate certain imperialist companies, the latifundia, banks, and the main monopoly enterprises in order to build state capitalism and not a genuine people's democracy. All this was done in an absurd manner without seizing political power from the owners of the means of production and without developing a people's movement really capable of seizing it. On the one hand, by defining what it was trying to do as socialism, the UP opened fire on all those who, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, in a big way or a small way, lived off the labor of others, and who therefore hated or feared socialism. In this way, through mere talk and without any purpose, for the proposed changes, even if the dominant intentions had been different from the revisionists, would not have created a socialist society, the UP made hundreds of thousands of enemies, while the real exploiters, who retained political power and their dominant influence in society, opened their arms to receive the support of the middle strata. If the proletariat is strong and maintains a correct orientation and a just policy of alliances, these middle sections can be led in varying degrees to oppose imperialism, the latifundists, and the monopoly bourgeoisie. but they will do so in order to better themselves as owners at the expense of the big exploiters, and not through the threat of being expropriated along with them by the immediate establishment of socialism. Lenin, in his epoch, although Russia was a capitalist country, albeit with semi-feudal survivals, had already answered the socialist revolutionaries who asserted, quote, "Why was it necessary first to support the peasant in general against the landlord, and then, at the same time, to support the proletariat against the peasant in general, instead of at once supporting the proletariat against the landlord? And what Marxism has to do with this, heaven knows," end quote, by pointing out, quote, "This is the standpoint of the most primitive, childishly naive anarchism. For many centuries, and even for thousands of years, mankind has dreamt of doing away, at once, with all and every kind of exploitation. These dreams remained mere dreams until millions of the exploited all over the world began to unite for a consistent, staunch, and comprehensive struggle to change capitalist society in the direction the evolution of that society is naturally taking. Socialist dreams turned into the socialist struggle of the millions only when Marx's scientific socialism had linked up the urge for change with the struggle of a definite class. Outside the class struggle, socialism is either a hollow phrase or a naive dream. In Russia, however, two different struggles of two different social forces are taking place before our very eyes. The proletariat is fighting against the bourgeoisie wherever capitalist relations of production exist. As a stratum of small landlords, of petty bourgeois, the peasantry is fighting against all survivals of serfdom, against the bureaucrats and the landlords. Only those who are completely ignorant of political economy and of the history of revolutions throughout the world can fail to see that these are two distinct and different social wars. To shut one's eyes to the diversity of these wars by demanding, at once, is like hiding one's head under one's wing and refusing to make any analysis of reality. End quote. In Chile, too, it was, and is, an absurdity to attempt to mobilize more than 30,000 owners of private non-monopoly industries, more than 150,000 non-latifundist agricultural landowners, more than 100,000 non-monopoly tradesmen, and several 100,000 professionals, handicraftsmen, and white-collar workers and other non-proletarian elements who live indirectly or directly from the exploitation of the proletariat, and on whom social ambitions and bourgeois anti-socialist influences weigh heavily, to mobilize these strata to accept the establishment of socialism at once. Lenin points out that the proletariat will rely for socialist revolution only on the, quote, "mass of semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to destroy the resistance of the bourgeoisie by force and to paralyze the instability of the peasants and the petty bourgeoisie," end quote. This will be done, of course, after the proletariat has solidified its position by turning large sections of the middle and petty bourgeoisie in the city and countryside against the landlords and the most reactionary sections of the society. In formulating revolutionary strategy for Chile, it was and is necessary to take into account the class aspirations of large intermediate sections and even of numerous petty bourgeois and semi-proletarian strata wanting to get out of poverty or to better themselves, not through socialism, but for individual prosperity. They will seek this prosperity by aligning themselves either with the big bourgeoisie and imperialism or with the proletariat, depending on which of the two shows the most strength and carries out the most correct policy of alliance. But under the UP government, practically all the parties in the coalition, including those which did not share this strategy, as well as MIR, spoke of socialist revolution. Thus, they greatly facilitated the alliance policy of imperialism and the big bourgeoisie. This was doubly serious in a country dominated by imperialism and located in its sphere of direct influence. In fact, the Trotskyist influence managed to make it seem shameful to speak of anything other than the establishment of socialism, and even the phony communists, with their inveterate opportunism, adopted this phraseology. The Trotskyists justified their rejection of any possible alliance between the proletariat and the non-monopoly sections of the bourgeoisie, agricultural, industrial, and commercial, by pointing to the close economic ties between these sections and imperialism and big monopoly capital. From this, they derived their fatalist, one-sided thesis that the proletariat could not mobilize these sections against imperialism, the landlords, and the big bourgeoisie. However, although it is certain these ties exist, it is equally certain that they are contradictory in nature, that they also reflect the various methods by which big monopoly capital, domestic and foreign, spoliates and ruins for its own profit the weaker non-monopoly capitalists. The latter, when they see the proletariat in a position of weakness, as it was under the UP government, make up their losses caused by imperialism and the monopoly bourgeoisie at the expense of the proletariat, and ally themselves with big capital. Another simplistic argument of the Trotskyists, no less false than the preceding, was to maintain that the policy of forming broad fronts led by the proletariat to smash its enemies step by step was inherent in the opportunist and reformist strategy of revisionism, in its line of opposing armed struggle and the destruction of the bourgeois state. However, this thesis is totally absurd, for all revolutions, without exception, that have defeated the bourgeoisie, despite the fact that some have since degenerated, have done so thanks to a policy of united front and of revolution by stages. The united fronts promoted by the phony Marxists, by the revisionists, are profoundly different from those led by Marxist-Leninists. The revisionists want the proletariat to achieve an alliance with the bourgeoisie on the basis of abandoning its leading role in the alliance, of making only concessions to the bourgeoisie, of abandoning revolutionary methods of struggle, and of respecting the legality and institutions of the bourgeois state. On the other hand, the united front around a proletarian line is based first of all on the revolutionary strength of the proletariat, on its ability to prove through facts that it can smash the big bourgeoisie, and, because of this, can give certain guarantees to the middle bourgeoisie if the latter supports its struggles. The military coup in Chile, and especially the policy of the military junta, which brutally turned against large numbers of capitalists, driving them to ruin after having used them politically against the UP government, has had the virtue of showing not only who are the main enemies against whom the fire has to be concentrated in the first stage, but also the fragility of the links between the middle strata and big capital and their eminently contradictory nature. The big bourgeoisie and imperialism first took these allies away from the UP, which was unable to win them over because of its weakness, in order to overthrow the Allende government, then brutally turned against them and drove them into bankruptcy so as to concentrate more capital in their own hands. The ferocity of the fascist repression in the service of big capital today allows it to act in a barefaced manner and to sacrifice the entire people to its veracity, including the middle bourgeoisie. This shows that the economic struggle between big monopoly capital and the middle bourgeoisie is deeper and more permanent than the alliance between them, an alliance they put into practice when they need to isolate the proletariat. Events since the coup d'etat have caused ideological embarrassment to the Trotskyist theoreticians, whose dogmatism leads them to refuse the middle strata any place in a front led by the proletariat and to deny the necessity of revolution by stages. Concrete facts show that it is the monopoly bourgeoisie and imperialism themselves which are trying to push these strata toward the proletariat. The ultra-reactionary nature of the policy of the dominant strata in Chile is actually creating the united front that these theoreticians reject in principle. By demonstrating the economic strength and repressive force of the strata that actually controlled and continue to control political power, without, up to now, even having to rely on military intervention by imperialism, the coup d'etat has shown still more clearly the absolute necessity of defining these strata as the target of revolution in the first stage of building the broadest united front against them under genuine proletarian leadership.